Viking Age society, marriage wasn't just a decision you made between two people. You like the look of each other and you go, let's get married. You had to involve your families. While one person could declare their readiness for marriage, it was largely determined by factors such as geographical proximity, wealth, status, and the connections between families, and also your status. So you're not going to have a poorer person marrying a wealthier person unless you're a woman and very attractive. A couple should not marry solely for love without the approval of their family. As seen in my books, very early on, my main character Astrid finds this out the hard way. And if a man did propose without his family's involvement or endorsement, he risked severe consequences, as it could be seen as a threat to the woman's status and value. So the consequences could be heavy fines or outlawry. And if you're not familiar with the concept of outlawry, if you were tossed out from your village, you not only were excluded from your community, your legal status also changed, and people were allowed to kill you without consequence. So it's a very big offense to compromise a woman's value. In the sagas, we see tragic outcomes for the couples that pledge their love and promise union without their family's involvements. These couples rarely, if ever, end up with the people that they love. So notable examples from the sagas are Brunhild and Sigurd, Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue, and Gunhild, Bolli, and Kjartan. Pretty much all of these, the woman is at the center. There's some sort of love triangle. She is pressured to marry the other person who's in love with her, the one that she doesn't reciprocate the feelings for, and everyone ends up dead. So, and they all underscore the importance of involving your family in marriage. Marriage negotiations usually began with the groom's family or a trusted representative on the groom's behalf approaching the bride's family. They would praise his virtues and his reputation, and the respect of this representative was crucial because it added weight to the negotiations, and also after the negotiations were completed, it added weight to the enforcement of a marriage. And here you might think enforcement of a marriage, forcing two people, but often when you make a decision, one person might have to wait 3 months to get married. They might have a better offer. They can't then break that contract and marry that person. So it's trying to enforce that. The bride's consent wasn't always legally required, believe it or not, but it was highly desirable. And many sagas tell of women forced into marriage for only for tragedy to follow. There is a story in the Yellinga saga. There's a woman called Queen Ossa. She was proposed marriage by King Guthrum of Bore. She refused him. Her father backed her decision and said no. He then came in and killed all of her male kin, stole her away and married her. A year later, she gave birth to their son, Halfdan, and convinced a servant to kill him, after which time she returned to her father's kingdom and ruled for 20 years in her own right before her son took over. So it's not going to work out. That tale is like a cautionary tale for the man. Don't steal women. It's not going to work out well for you. So for us, we might find this system of relationships difficult to understand because now it's a very independent decision. You meet someone, you fall in love with them, that's how it works for us. But it's important to remember that the female and the male spheres were very different, and a woman's experience with men would have been limited only to her male kin, her brothers, her fathers, her uncles. And that marriage, the idea of marriage was for a strategic union to protect wealth, ensure status, and produce heirs. So ensuring that the prospective groom wasn't just all looks and nothing to back him up, that he could protect and provide, was absolutely paramount. We'll see this a lot in Viking Age society, that a lot of the laws are showing that they're not interested in coupling or supporting people who can't afford to protect and provide for themselves. So some couples did have the opportunity to get to know each other, often through brief encounters at the feasts, and once both families agreed to the match, the next thing was the cost of marriage. Now, when we think about the cost of marriage, what are we thinking about?
The wedding cake.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and while those things would have been considered, there actually is 3 things that you have to pay for even before you get to the ceremony, or 3 things you have to agree to pay before you get to the ceremony. So we've got the dowry, which would be familiar to us. It was called heimenfylgja. So in Old Norse, that means to follow from home. We have the bride price, or the munda meaning protection, and the morning gift, or morgen gifu, and that's a direct translation, morning gift. And I will take some guesses if anyone has an idea of what morning gift might be. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah, you're actually pretty close. Yeah. So I did this slide really quickly last night because my partner was confused about who pays who what. So the bride's family paid the dowry to the groom's family, and this typically represented her inheritance, because when her father died, unlike the males in their family, she typically didn't get anything. The dowry could be made up of valuable goods like gold, silver, livestock, cloth, or weapons, basically anything they had to trade that would give value to the woman. It was for the couple's use during marriage, and the husband had absolutely no right to squander it. So he couldn't just take it and use it for his own gain. The dowry was especially important in cases of divorce or widowhood, as it ensured the woman's financial security. Now, the bride price and the morning gift was paid by the groom's family, not always to the bride, but to the bride's family, to that side of the slide. So the bride price was generally equal to the dowry and made up of similar goods, whatever they needed to exchange. So for example, exactly, genuine trade. So if some people had a lot of really good cattle, for example, but the other place they had really good cloth, they would exchange something, or weapons. Weapons were really popular. And this was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family. This was compensation for the loss of her labor on the farm or the farmstead. So that's why we've got like the munda. This is a promise to protect, going over to them, compensation. So the bride price had two parts. You've got a down payment. Down payment before the wedding. So that's like, this is contractually our offering. And then after the marriage was concluded, or at the time that the woman went to her new husband's homestead, the bride price would be exchanged. So you couldn't just offer anything in the Viking Age. There was a poor man's price, an absolute base minimum. And this was generally, we see anything from like 8 to 12, 14 ounces of silver. And if a man could not afford this, he was simply considered too poor to marry and support the children that would result from the union. So again, we're seeing in the Viking Age, we're not interested in supporting people who can't support themselves. Yes, so in my books, Astrid is a widow and is able to negotiate her own bride price, and this is the remarks that she gives. Fine, if you do need to pay the obligatory standard bride price, where I come from is 12 ounces, I explained, stepping over the threshold and onto the landing. His mouth hung open, and he covered it, feigning shock. Do you take me for a poor man, Astrid, one that does not value his woman? So you can see there that many would aspire to offer much more for their bride, because in offering much more, you're demonstrating your wealth and your power. Okay, so moving on to the morning gift. So the morning gift was paid after the wedding night, as you rightly pointed out. The groom presented this to his bride, and it was generally in the form of transportable wealth. So we're talking about like gold, coins, or jewels, and this was hers to keep, exclusively hers. It was the gift for making herself available to her husband's needs, and also for the upcoming hazards of childbirth, kind of like a Viking Age push present. So before the bride received her morning gift, however, the wedding rituals had to be completed.
So in some ways, that's kind of respectful.
There was a lot of respect in terms of like the relationship, and we have to remove our ideas of respect, but it is saying like, you're here with me, you're here to serve and be loyal. And she not only served her husband, but the entire hall. Like, her job was to go out and serve the beverages and things and oversee everything. So it is like saying, here, this is the value I bestow on you for your use. You can use it however you like for all of your life. And I mean, it wouldn't have been the only gift he would ever give her, but a mark of respect. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't always that case. Exactly, yeah. And of course, the wealthier the woman, the more beautiful the gift would be. So I will point out at this point that we don't have a comprehensive account of Viking Age marriage. We have snippets from the sagas, and part of the reason of the lack of detail may be the secrecy around pagan practices. It could also be the omission of pagan practices from the records from writers such as Snorri Sturluson, who was writing later in a Christian Scandinavia. So to write about such pagan practices for him would have been risky, might have been seen as like promoting it. So that is why we probably don't, that's probably why we don't have a lot of clear information. But from what we do know, the ceremony could take place in a temple, if there was one, which was uncommon, except in important places. But more often than not, it would be a sacred grove or other outdoor space. The ritual would be presided over by a githa or a gothi, which were a Viking Age priest or priestess. And though their presence wasn't actually required, the only essential element were these: oaths, witnesses, and a ceremony of some kind. Weddings typically occurred in summer, and if you're not familiar with the division of the Viking Age calendar, it's split down the middle. Half is summer and half is winter. So when the sun's out, it's summer. When the sun is not out, it's winter. So Friday was the main day, as it honoured Frigg, the goddess of marriage and motherhood. And in the days leading up to the marriage, they had to do some sort of preparations. Most notable for the females would be preparing with her female kin. This was the last time she would wear her hair down unbound. So for the wedding ceremony, she would wear her hair unbound, and then after the ceremony, she would cover it with a headdress to mark her new status as a wife. So unmarried girls didn't generally cover their hair in the same way. For a man, he would go and retrieve an ancestral weapon, usually a sword, which would be used in the ceremony. This weapon would be usually typically presented to his bride during the ceremony, which would signify the inheritance of strength and protection, which she would hold on trust for their future sons. And of course, both of them before the ceremony would go to the bathhouse separately and bathe and ready themselves to enter their new life. During the ceremony, rings could be exchanged. So we do have lots of finger rings in archaeology found. And these would be presented again on the pommel here of the sword. This was not just symbolic. This was kind of a representation of you're getting married, and the sword, the sharpness of the sword, represented the dangers if one was to break their oaths made to each other. And I'm not talking about fidelity, especially on the man's part, that wasn't important. I'm talking about like protecting and supporting each other, mostly financially, and to reach his ambitions. And while we don't know exactly what was said during the vows, we can infer that the gods were called to witness, oaths of support and loyalty were exchanged, and the traditional till death do us part was probably omitted because we don't find the same stigma around divorce as we do in Christianity, and we have clearly defined reasons, and they're not super strict for divorce. So we can infer that there was no obligation to remain until death, and we see this. As you'll see when we talk about divorce, lots of the laws are for women's protection and for women's right to divorce. So a man was able to take another wife if he wanted and had the money to do so. A woman was not allowed to find another husband. So,
Polygamy, he could take a second wife.
yes, so if he can afford to keep a second wife and do all of that, he could. He didn't have to get her permission either. But I mean, if you keeping good relations and things like that. But we have lots of stories where men go off on raids and bring back a concubine, and that's completely fine. So the fidelity part on his part is not important. It is for her only because the offspring inherit his wealth. Yeah. Sad for the women in marriages that aren't, but maybe once the man left them alone, they were okay. Because also the women's sphere, in wealthier households, women had their own separate dwellings sometimes, not necessarily to sleep, but to do all the women's chores, so they could live quite separately. So at this celebration, the wedding feast, the newlyweds would drink from the same cup, eat and celebrate with their friends and family, and later they would consummate their marriage and be considered wed. So Helga would have been given her mourning gift the next day and the keys to the storehouse and larder, and thus they would commence their married life. But what happened when it didn't work out? Going straight into it there. You needn't stay in a toxic marriage during the Viking Age. There were clearly defined rules on how you could get out of it. And a lot of this legislation, the laws, come from Icelandic law, which is the closest that we have to the rules, because they all migrated there because they were getting away from a unification in Norway. So we have violence, which is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm not talking about a slap. If a man slapped his wife in front of guests, he was required to pay a fine against her honour, but it wasn't a reason for divorce. I'm talking about something that probably would be considered today as grievous bodily harm: bone, blood, or body. Financial strain was also another reason, and it's not because you're too poor as a union, it's because, say for example, you married and the other half of the family suddenly become impoverished and want to try and claim your wealth. You separate to protect that. Forced relocation, again talking about Iceland, men could not take their wives without their consent to Iceland or anywhere else. So that was a form. If he wanted to go and you really didn't want to go, you could divorce. Dressing outside of gender norms, women wearing pants and men wearing low-cut shirts. Although there's lots of stories that we see where they do and it's okay, but other times they do it and they divorce. So we see that as like a reason, an easy out. And also for incompatibility and unhappiness. So again, it's mostly focused on women's rights being able to get out of a marriage, because like I said, men were allowed to take another wife if they could afford. But if they couldn't afford, they could also utilize the divorce. Now the process of divorce was pretty simple, but I imagine it would have taken a lot of courage, because you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and isolation. So even though you divorce, where are you going? It had to be made in front of witnesses. No, yeah, exactly. But you could go back to your family. But again, you stayed a lot of the time, right? Yeah, except in cases of violence, you'd really want to get away. So it had to be made in front of witnesses again. The grievances would be laid out, and then assets would be divided, and generally what was left apportioned for like the blame, apportioned. So if a man was particularly violent and a woman could take more of like her dowry and everything, she would just take it. And if there were children that resulted from it, for the first year, women would take the small children to nurse, but as we see with most of this, men could claim the children were theirs. So, but we do have lots of stories of them being fostered. Like foster relationships are very important, so they might have gone to brother-in-laws and things like that, so there's no clear defined. All right, and for widows and divorcees, especially those of childbearing age, you would have remarried pretty quickly, because you had the need to service farms and to raise children. This was common, and sagas tell of women marrying their deceased husbands, brothers or friends simply because they were willing and available. And in my series, Astrid faces this very challenge when her first husband dies and her her stepson tries to force her to remarry. And pressured to remarry, whether love plays a role in that decision and how much control she has over her fate is this kind of central question of the entire series.